Chapter 1899 Mirrored Darkness. Sunny knew what was supposed to happen. In fact, it was very simple. The answer was nothing. Mordred's reflections were strange creatures, after all. They were neither dead nor alive, either divine nor profane. A long time ago, when he killed the mirror beast on Reckoning Island, the spell had announced the kill, but did not whisper anything about his shadow growing stronger. Sunny was banished from the nightmare spell now, but the result would be the same. Killing reflections did not grant him fragments, and no shadow would appear in the silent stillness of his soul. Therefore, Saint was unlikely to receive any reward for slaying the supreme reflection, either. Even its darkness was merely a reflection of Revel's own. Now that the living mirror was gone and there was nothing left to reflect it, the false darkness would most likely disappear, as well, which was a real shame. Sunny really felt that Saint deserved to receive a boon after fighting a battle as dreadful as this one had been, especially considering that she had forged her path to transcendence by taking the essence of nightmare creatures wielding powers over true darkness. Sunny had never been clear on how exactly Saint was able to increase her class. He did not know how to help her reach a new rank without the assistance of the spell, either. So, he had hoped that defeating a being of true darkness, even if it was a reflection, would grant her some kind of reward. But it was not meant to be, or so he thought. Even though Sunny could not see anything, he still felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere of the ancient castle. If he could see, though, he would have witnessed the dark splendor of what was happening around him and Serpent. Saint stood motionlessly, her unshaken hand still making a fist. Glass sand slowly poured from between her fingers, and at the same time, the fluid darkness around her stirred. It flowed like a vast whirlpool around the graceful stone knight, whose ruby eyes continued to burn with cold crimson flames in the surging darkness. The ethereal vortex spun faster and faster, pulling more strands of darkness into its silent torrent. Some distance away, Revel was rising to her feet. Sensing something, she threw a sharp gaze at Saint. Saint met that gaze calmly, no emotion betraying itself on her inhumanly beautiful, flawless onyx face. At that moment, the torrent of darkness came alive, and poured into her body. The darkness entered her chest like a raging flood and was absorbed into her fiery heart. But that was not all. Suddenly, Sunny felt a hint of a faintly familiar, terrifying chill. If he could see, he would have seen the mirrored darkness start to change in the absence of the slain reflection. Some of it dissolved into wisps of an eerie, chilling white mist. He knew that mist all too well. However, Saint was unmoved. Still staring at Revel silently, she remained motionless, and eagerly absorbed the wisps of the white mist, as well. All of it happened in the span of several heartbeats, and by the end of it, the sphere of true darkness enveloping the hall of the ancient citadel had shrunk a bit. It still drowned their surroundings, though, trapping Sunny in its cold embrace. Revel smiled coldly. So full of surprises. As she rose to her feet and looked around in search of her sword, a cold voice suddenly responded from the darkness. Don't be shocked just yet. The voice belonged to Sunny, who had separated himself from Serpent and manifested his avatar into a corporeal form once again. Without the enhanced perception of Dire Fang's aspect, he suddenly felt deaf and lost. The true darkness enveloped everything around him, making him blind. It was an uncomfortable position to be in, but it had to be done. Serpent was more fragile than Saint and Fiend. It had already received plenty of gruesome wounds, so Sunny silently dismissed the bleeding shadow. Saint, meanwhile, was mangled even more terribly. He would have recalled her into the nurturing haven of his lightless soul. However, it was not time yet. Instead, Sunny spent more of his essence to take control of another incarnation, one of the three shadows that had remained fused with the graceful stone knight, augmenting her battered body. Instantly, he had returned to the previous state of unity with his taciturn shadow. He could see the ruined hall through her eyes, including his own back, which stood between her and Revel. He could also feel how weak and broken her body was. The flowing darkness caressed it softly, helping the terrible wounds heal. but they weren't healing fast enough, and the damage was too dire. Saint was in no condition to continue the fight. There was something else, as well, something about her had changed. But he couldn't quite tell what it was. It wasn't an evolution to a higher rank, and it wasn't an evolution to a great class either. However, there was definitely a deep, unfamiliar power taking root both in her body and in her soul, or, rather, in the vast shadow that served as her soul. For now, it did not matter. Saint's inability to support him in the battle against Revel did not matter either. Now that the Princess of Song was without support, Sunny was confident enough to face her alone, especially because he wasn't blind anymore. Of course, seeing himself from Saint's perspective was a bit strange, as if he was observing himself in the third person. Being robbed of shadow sense left Sunny feeling dazed, too, but he was nothing if not supremely adaptable. Even in this weird state, he could still fight, and win. Defeat was not an option, and honestly enough, he had quite a burning desire to make Revel pay for hurting his shadows. Smiling viciously behind the mask, Sunny looked up at her. Now, first of all, he had to prevent her from reaching her sword. Serpent was gone, after all, and there were no shadows around to manifest into a weapon, so Sunny was unarmed. If Revel did manage to pick up her sword, or lived long enough to dismiss it and summon it back, things could become problematic. Commanding Saint to retreat, Sunny clenched his fists and dashed forward. Chapter 1900 Vanquishing Light. Amidst the flames consuming what remained of the pinnacle of the Garden Temple, Nephice was fighting against Moonveil and her two reflections. Countless wounds were littering her body, and she felt a strange, nearly forgotten feeling of growing weak from losing too much blood. Transcendent bodies were tough, but they weren't indestructible. She had accounted for her miraculous physique when calculating how much punishment her body could take without sacrificing too much of its functionality, and that limit was approaching swiftly. Nevertheless, her expression was calm, and her movements were just as fluid and unrestrained as they had been before. Her hands never wavered on the hilt of her sword. The battle was ruthless and unrelenting. Triumph and defeat were separated only by a thin, brittle line. Moonveil was strong, but Nephice was stronger. Moonveil wielded her saber as if it was an extension of her body, her skill both beautiful and polished to a state of near perfection, but Nephice was a much better swordsman, and had a much deeper command over the cadence of battle. Even without her aspect, she could have defeated the proud Princess of Song. But precisely for that reason, there were two supreme reflections aiding Moonveil, and dealing with them was much harder. Someone had evaluated the strength of the sword domain champions very well. Nephice was using shaping to control the surrounding flames and keep the reflections at bay. Sometimes she managed to slow them down, and sometimes she failed. When facing two or more enemies at the same time, she followed her perilous strategy: to disregard everything in pursuit of killing Moonveil, even if it meant sacrificing her blood and bone. As a result, the beautiful princess was forced to defend herself without having a chance to launch a counterattack. Her reflections, however, made up for that with a vengeance. Ah! It hurts. Both Nephice and Moonveil were bloodied, however, Nephice was bleeding more. Her wounds were more dire, and more plentiful. It was already starting to become a detriment to her strength and mobility. Not because she was paralyzed by pain, but simply because her muscles were cut, her tendons were damaged, and her bones were cracked. She had managed to avoid receiving truly debilitating damage, but the harm done by countless small wounds was slowly mounting. Moonveil could see that, as well. Therefore, she grew a little more confident. Nephice would have smiled if it didn't seem like a lot of effort got her. She remembered being a fairly straightforward person, a long time ago. But somehow, over the years, she couldn't quite remember how, Nephice had come to value deceit and misdirection, even if it was not something she was naturally good at. She must have learned how to use lies to her advantage by quietly observing people around her. If so, she had been blessed with good teachers, shifting her weight from one leg to another, As if preparing to launch a new strike, Nephi's grimaced and swayed. It looked like her right leg, which had been cut gruesomely by one of the reflections before, finally betrayed her. The reflection itself was a dozen meters away, pushed back by a torrent of flame. The other was just behind Nephi's. Since she had just evaded its attack and sidestepped the creature. It would take it a little time to spin around and renew its assault. So, the only one who could use her momentary loss of balance was Moonveil herself. Strangely enough, Nephis was a good actress. Her act was subtle, but convincing. The grimace she had made was just small enough to look involuntary. The nature of her misstep was reasonable and believable, since her right leg was indeed damaged quite severely. Her eyes even widened slightly, selling the moment of realization more. If Moonveil hesitated, she did not show it. Instead, she decisively lunged into a swift attack, her white hair fluttering in the wind. Neff's gaze instantly turned cold and heavy. Too honest. Who would have thought that the fearsome princess of song would be a little naive, abandoning all pretense of weakness? She righted her stance and sent her long sword into a simple thrust. Her attack was simple and unadorned, however. That did not make it any less deadly. Because, even when two transcendent champions fought, the fundamentals of combat still played a significant role in the outcome of the battle. Speed, mass, force, time, movement, and space. In this instance, the fundamental principle that doomed Moonveil was rather obvious, something the importance of which most humans of the walking world learned as children. It was the simple fact that Neff's sword was longer than her elegant saber, and therefore, before Moonveil could behead Nephis with a decisive slash, the kinslayer pierced her chest, penetrated her heart, snapped her spine, and exited from her back. Blood spilled on the floor. The saber clattered as it fell. The delicate woman stared at Nephis in disbelief, her beautiful eyes widening in horror. I won. Neffs had achieved her goal. However, she did not feel any joy or elation. All she felt was regret, because humanity had lost a powerful saint, one of many that would die in this appalling, senseless war. It was such a waste. But then again, the battle wasn't over yet. She had no time to. Pushing her mangled body as hard as she could, Nephis reeled back to avoid the reflection's saber. The creature moved past her, the sharp blade whistling past her neck. In the next moment, a small hand struck her in the chest, sending Nephis flying back. She hit the floor a couple dozen meters away and rolled awkwardly, her vision blurring momentarily from the terrible surge of pain. By the time she staggered back to her feet, both reflections were near Moonveil. One was holding her in its arms, while the other was standing between them and Nephis. She pushed some air into her burning lungs. Now, what happens next depends on the nature of Moonveil's aspect. Either the haze placed on her would disappear with Moonveil's death, unsealing her aspect, or it would not. If it was the former, she would be able to deal with the reflections quite easily. If it was the latter, things would turn really ugly. However, in the next second, something unexpected happened, something Nephis had not anticipated, even though she should have. Moonveil was dying, but her eyes regained their sharpness for a split second, piercing Nephis with a heavy gaze. And then, Nephis felt the seal binding her aspect suddenly fall apart. Moonveil had released it. At the same time, the reflection holding the Princess of Song in its hands shimmered slightly. And changed, assuming a new form. Silver hair, fair skin, and calm gray eyes. A face that could have been beautiful if it was expressive and lively instead of being cold and motionless like a lifeless mask. A lithe and slender body. It was her own face, and her own body. The reflection had mirrored Nephis. She belatedly understood her mistake. A moment later, a soft radiance enveloped the hands of the reflection, pouring into Moonveil's body, and Moonveil's terrible wounds miraculously healed. Nephis stared at her from a distance, feeling dismayed. What a cheat! The Princess of Song was as good as new, of course, now that Nephis had been given back her aspect. Her wounds were also healing, and a raging flame was rising in her soul. For a moment, nobody moved. Moonveil was panting heavily, looking at Nephi's with a hint of wariness. Nephi, meanwhile, smiled a little. On the other hand, that works, as well. Moonveil and her two reflections wore somber expressions as they readied themselves to continue the battle, which would grow infinitely more devastating and terrible now, without a doubt. But Nephi was about to surprise them, as well. She unleashed the suppressed power of her aspect, assuming the incinerating form of the radiant spirit. At the same time, she called upon the sea of flames surrounding them, wrapping it around herself like a mantle. However, she did not direct all that fiery power at her enemies. Instead, she aimed it at the wooden floor beneath her feet. Surrounded by blinding light and a raging tide of immolating fire, Nephi fled from the battle and rushed down, piercing one level of the ancient citadel after another like a falling star. Countless layers of mystical wood parted in front of her, crumbling into ash, as she burned a scorching path into the depths of the castle, lower and lower, and lower still, until she plunged into a sea of impenetrable darkness, vanquishing it with her light. Chapter 1901 Falling Sunday. Sunny was in the throes of the familiar state of merciless clarity. He was fighting Revel in the ruins of the Dark Hall, pushing his body and mind to the absolute limits, each breath searing his lungs like acid. The devastating fury of their clash made the world quake. Everything around them was enveloped by flowing darkness and suffocating smoke, the air suffused with sweltering heat. Neither Sunny nor Revel were armed, using nothing but their bodies to destroy each other. The rolling echoes of their crushing blows were like deafening thunderclaps, and both moved at a speed far greater than what a mundane human would have been able to perceive. The battle was fierce, fearsome, and chillingly ruthless. Its frenetic pace was daunting. Its violent brutality was appalling. Sunny was having a tough time. Devoid of the ability to call upon his aspect, he could only rely on his physical might and combat technique to fight Revel. The problem, however, was that her transcendent form was more than twice his height, with much longer arms and legs, which gave her a tremendous advantage in reach, and that was not even counting her one remaining wing. Sunny's disadvantage was only confounded by the fact that he was witnessing the battle through Saint's eyes, not his own. He was more used to seeing himself from the third perspective than most people do to long years of perceiving the world through the shadows, but it was still a disorienting experience to fight while only relying on someone else's sight. Revel had figured out that he was somehow relying on Saint to guide him almost instantly, and made several attempts to destroy the wounded shadow. Sunny managed to block her from reaching Saint, but she methodically attacked him from positions where his own body blocked the living statue's view. Worst of all, Light Slayer could still use her aspect freely, which she did with great foresight and skill. At any moment, the beautiful demon could turn into a torrent of flowing darkness to escape, advance, circle around Sunny, or simply bypass his attack. It was infuriating, reminding Sunny of the battle he had fought against Fiend in Falcon Scott. It felt as if he was fighting himself, which was not a pleasant feeling at all. Now that he was suffering at the hands of an enemy who possessed such an ability, he learned painfully well just how much of a cheat his shadow step was. He could not do anything against her aspect ability, but he could somewhat negate her advantage in size by manipulating his weight with the feather of truth. Sunny might have been smaller, but his mass was even greater than that of the towering Demoness. As a result, his blows were especially devastating, and it was harder for her to throw him off balance. His armor was shattered, and his body was hurting. And yet, so was hers. Sunny was holding his ground while surrounded by true darkness, trading blow for blow with its Saint. It was just that damned wing. As Sunny blocked Revel's clawed hand, the obsidian talon stung his side, where the surface of the onyx mantle was already cracked. Feeling a pulse of sharp pain, he hissed and tried to grab the retreating wing, only to be sent stumbling back by a devastating kick. A thin crack crossed the surface of his mask. Worse still, Revel was already turning into a torrent of darkness, rushing toward Saint. Damn it! Sunny ignored the pain and dashed forward to intercept her. But at that moment, he felt the entire citadel shudder. and a thunderous boom resounded from far above, followed by another a moment later, and then another. And then another, almost without pause. It was as if something was tearing through the ancient castle, traveling toward the ground at terrible speed. Then, the heat permeating the air seemed to grow 10 times more intense, and Sonny was confused for a moment. What is that? For a split second, he failed to recognize what was happening. Then, he realized that he was actually seeing something with his own eyes. Something was glowing in the darkness high above him. The ceiling of the vast hall had long collapsed, and even higher still, several orange spots seemed to have revealed themselves on the ceiling of the higher floor of the ancient castle, expanding as they grew. Suddenly able to see again, Sonny froze for a short moment. In that short moment, the burning ceiling exploded with a deafening roar, and a blinding radiance blinded him all over again. It was as if the sun had risen in the middle of the citadel, or rather, fell down from the sky, surrounded by a sea of flames, an incandescent being plummeted from the burning inferno above, crashing into the floor between Sonny and Revel and instantly setting it on fire. Covering his eyes, he staggered back. Revel's darkness was vanquished, and he could finally sense the shadows again. There was a white silhouette standing in the middle of the raging conflagration, so beautiful and pure that it seemed out of place in this dirty and imperfect world. Sonny's lips twisted into a smile behind his cracked mask. Nephis had arrived from whatever battle she had been fighting, practically bringing the entire citadel down with her. From the brief glimpse Sonny had got, it seemed as if every floor of the ancient castle above them was at least partially destroyed and set aflame. That certainly explained the smoke and the unbearable heat. The radiant spirit of light slowly looked around, taking in the sight of the devastated hall. The broken walls, the hideous wounds littering Saint's body, Sonny's breached armor. Finally, her gaze settled on the bloodied, but still breathtakingly beautiful figure of the creature of darkness staring at her with a grim expression. Revel looked at Nephis, and then smiled coldly. Her lips parted, and a single word escaped from her lips. Crap!